Hi, and welcome to Axelbank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. I'm Evan Axelbank, and today we're going to speak with James Kirchick, the author of Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington. This is his second book. He's also written essays for almost every major publication and is senior fellow for the Europe Center for the Atlantic Council. James, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Before we start our interview, I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelbankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. Since Washington, D.C. became a thing, it's been a place where dreams are made of for people who want to be in the room where it happens. But written out of that history, and I can tell you that because I feel like I've read a lot of that history, has been the lives of those who are gay and who are living in Washington, D.C., and what happened to them when they went to Washington. The title of James' book, Secret City, offers a clue as to what life was like for those who were in the closet. Those who tried to serve our country faced ruin if their secret ever got out. So, James, first of all, tell me about your dedication page. It was very emotional and I think a great way to start. To those who unburden themselves, you write, of their secret, so I didn't have to live with mine. When and how did you realize you owed these trailblazers a mention?
That's a very good question. I can't point to a specific moment, but I felt in general just a real sense of responsibility in writing this book because if you are gay, there is not necessarily any sort of, generational connection that you have to your people, so to speak, like you do if you are Black or Italian or Jewish or a member of any other group, right? You're born into that tradition. And your parents and your grandparents and your aunts and your uncles, they all teach you about, your history, the history of I'm Jewish, right? So I know a lot about the Jewish experience and Jewish history because I went to Hebrew school and I have Jewish relatives.
Me too.
Obviously. Yeah. And that applies to people of really any group, except if you're gay. If you're gay, maybe you'll have a gay relative, but you're probably, at least people of my generation, most of us didn't. And so you have to learn all this on your own. You have to learn not only what it means to be a gay person and how to function in society, you also have to learn where you came from and what it was like for people before you. You're not going to learn that through personal interactions. You're going to learn it maybe through culture, through books, through movies, through television shows. And so I really felt in writing this book that I wanted to write a book that I wanted to read and that I didn't have. And as someone who's very interested in politics and American history and American politics in the 20th century and the Cold War and presidents and administrations and foreign policy and really all the events and phenomena and personalities that I was writing about, there was no book that explained what it was like to be gay in American politics, really. And so I felt that was the responsibility that I had in writing it. That's what drove me to write it. And I felt that I, owed a debt to those people who came before, who had it a lot harder than I did.
In general, why did and why does Washington, D.C. attract people who are gay? Does it provide a convenient place for those who don't feel comfortable in their home regions, let's say, because Washington, D.C. is, of course, a magnet of people from all 50 states. Is it a place for people who don't feel comfortable in their home areas to congregate and also be at the same time contributing members of society?
Well, it simultaneously attracted and repelled gay people, which I think is what makes the book sort of exciting and where the dramatic tension lies. So my book begins in the 1930s, which is the New Deal. And, Washington is becoming a massive city. It's moving from a kind of sleepy southern town into a massive city. The size of the population more than doubles, at the beginning of the Roosevelt administration to the time World War II is beginning. You're having all these new federal agencies are being built up. And then the war itself, that just adds to this sense of growth that Washington is undergoing. And so, yes, you have, the story of the gay experience in America in the 20th century is a story of urbanization. It's gay people leaving small towns, parochial, provincial lives, and moving to cities where they can, live more anonymously if they want. They can live in an apartment building and they're not living under the kind of prying eyes of family or, neighbors spying on them and whatnot, and the kind of more conservative mores that existed in rural life. In Washington is providing a lot of jobs in this regard. But there's another way I think it was particularly attractive to gay men, and this has to do with a sort of personality type that's been described as the best little boy in the world syndrome, which is you have a lot of young boys who realize they're gay, and so they're channeling a lot of their, perhaps energy that might go into chasing girls. They're channeling it into schoolwork. They are, because they have this deep, dark secret that they can't share, they become very good at maybe pleasing authority, maybe overcompensating in a way to protect themselves from scrutiny. And they're also bachelors, right? Many of them, some of them, obviously, many of them do get married and have children. But if those who didn't want to choose that life, they could move to Washington, and you could be a bachelor and have a respectable existence and not be questioned all the time. Particularly in an institution like the State Department, where I write a lot about in the book. There are a lot of gay men who are attracted to the State Department because you can travel overseas for many years at a time, and people aren't going to ask questions if you're single. And so Washington is attracting gay people, men and women, for these reasons, but it's also repelling them because officially Washington is not welcoming to gay people. And we can get into that later.
Why did you organize the book by presidential administration? Did the presidential administration aspect of this make for just a convenient timing mechanism, or was there a truly purposeful, a truly remarkable difference between how the administrations treated people who were gay?
There are a few reasons. One is practical, and that it was easier to organize when you have all this vast information and you're writing a sweeping book that spans Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Bill Clinton. It was just sort of, as a researcher and as someone writing a book, it was just easier to kind of group everything by presidential administration. Also, I think, Americans love the presidents, or we love reading about presidents. We think about our history in terms of presidential eras and, epochs and whatnot. And also, the more research I did, the more writing I did, I really felt that each president sort of had a distinctive attitude towards this issue that I was writing about, homosexuality. And you could learn something about the presidents. It sort of spoke to them and their character in different ways. Like, I thought, we learn a lot about FDR and what kind of man he was through the way that he treated Sumner Welles, his very close aide in the State Department, who was the first victim of the kind of anti-gay purge in the federal government. And also the way he reacted towards a political adversary of his, David Wolf, who was a conservative Democratic senator from Massachusetts, who was also sort of swept up in the anti-gay hysteria. I think we learned a lot about about FDR as a person. We learned a lot about JFK as a person through his relationship with his best friend, a man named Lem Billings, who was a friend of his from high school, who was gay, and whose homosexuality did not matter to JFK. I think we learn about JFK's character through that. Go ahead.
Well, before we get to some of the other to some of the presidents and some of the stories that you're talking about there, I did want to ask: did you make an effort to research the story of? Did you make an effort to research the story of the secret city even before FDR? I mean, the book starts with FDR, but was there enough? Did you check out to see if I could go back to maybe Wilson or Taft or Grover Cleveland and Abraham Lincoln? How far back does this history go in a way that
Well,
could be documented in a book?
I mean, I do address sort of gay people and gay issues from the very founding of the country. I begin with the man who designed the city of Washington, Pierre L'Enfant, who may quite possibly was gay. I talk about the German or the Prussian General von Steuben, who was gay, who was a crucial leader in the Revolutionary War. I talk about the rumors surrounding Abraham Lincoln. This is all in the prologue, though. I mean, this is a long book, and I didn't want to make it 2 volumes. And the reason I decided to start with FDR and really around the New Deal, but really World War II, is because I wanted that is when homosexuality transforms from being just a sin and a medical condition, and it becomes a national security threat. And the reason is because there's this fear that gay people are more susceptible to blackmail. That wasn't a concern before World War II. It was, homosexuality was a sin. You could be in trouble for it, clearly. But I really didn't come across any kind of gay political scandals until World War II. It really is Sumner Welles is the first sort of gay political scandal that I came across in American history, where this was used as a political weapon. And I think that's instrumental, that the rise of the national security state and the rise of this conception of national security, which doesn't really exist before World War II. I mean, America had a military, obviously. We fought in World War I, but this sense that, the nation needed to be secure and we needed bureaucracies like the CIA, which isn't founded until after World War II. This doesn't really begin until the Second World War. And that is when homosexuality becomes securitized. It transforms from being just a sin and a medical condition to being something that is a societal threat, right? And so that's what fascinated me. And the reason why the book ends with Clinton is because that is the end of the Cold War. And it's when gay people can get security clearances. They've been banned from having security clearances at the outset of the Cold War. And it's not until the end of the Cold War where that sort of pervasive fear and paranoia around gay people in government comes to an end.
Really curious what your sources were for this one. Are there papers that are housed in one central location, or because you're spanning many generations and also many people, did you have to go from public papers to public papers and newspaper to newspaper?
Yeah, I mean, I visited, you can look at the bibliography, it's very extensive. I visited multiple presidential libraries. Some of them I could do the work online because they digitized a lot of their files, but basically every presidential library from FDR to Clinton, I consulted. The National Archives, where the FBI records, I had a lot of declassified FBI files. Those are held by the National Archives here up in Maryland, also in Washington, D.C. They also hold the State Department records, old State Department records that I was consulting. There were a number of personal paper collections that were quite useful. For instance, the papers of Ben Bradley, who was the legendary editor of the Washington Post for a good chunk of the period that I was writing about. He was editor of the Washington Post in the late 60s until really the book ends, the 90s. I found quite a few interesting papers in his personal paper collection. So yeah, it was a mix. And then, of course, newspaper archives, both online and then on microfilm. Yeah, I mean dozens of newspapers.
Talk about, as we get into the content a little bit here, talk about Lafayette Square. I was fascinated by Lafayette Square because it's a place that certainly I know and that many people who have visited Washington know. Why was that an important entry point for this discussion?
I think Lafayette Square is a fascinating place, and it says so much about what this book is about. In that this is the park directly across the street from the White House. So it's directly across the street from where the most powerful man in the world lives, and it is there where, from the late 19th century onwards, is the main sort of gay cruising grounds. By which this is the main area where gay men would meet each other. They would have sex under the bushes or in the public restroom, or it was just a place to meet. And I think that says so much about what this book is about, right? That like under the eyes of the president of the United States, here is this meeting ground where this most despised group of people would meet each other. Um, and it's there where a lot of action in this book takes place. I mean, there are records dating back to the late 19th century of the local police making arrests of men there.
And
At
did
some point,
presidents know? Did presidents know this sitting there?
not until later. I mean, there are. It does becomes the butt of jokes, really. I think in the 1940s and 50s, when the sort of sex panic in what's known as the Lavender Scare really takes off in the 1950s, and there are reports in the newspapers, and this is very devastating, is that they used to print the names of the men who would be arrested along oftentimes with their occupations, right? So it would list, you know, Joe whatever, right? Teacher or lawyer. And it comes as a shock to a lot of people because these men who are being arrested, most of them were not, criminals. They were not homeless people. They weren't vagrants. They weren't hobos. They were professionals. They were white collar, well educated professionals. Um,
And is that
and
why you say a lot of people never asked, what do you do, right? That's the most common question in Washington is, what do you
yes,
do? And people
yes, and
wouldn't
people
ask
would
that
often give,
question.
yeah, and in gay bars, people would often give aliases. They would not give their real names. They would not, and they would certainly not ask where they worked, because there were oftentimes undercover police officers, who would go undercover to arrest people and set people up in entrapment operations and whatnot.
Uh,
So yes, it
um,
was very dangerous to be a gay man in Washington during this period of time.
so you open the book with, well, not quite open the book, but it's one of the early vignettes in the book about Sumner Wells, who was an FDR aide, and he was brought down by his attempts to have liaisons on a train. What happened to him, and how typical was that sort of, ousting of somebody, um, in Washington? And, did he expect that was going to happen if he got caught?
Yeah, I mean, he was a very powerful, well-bred New England blue blood who was who was related to the Roosevelts. He was actually a page boy at FDR's wedding. Um, top of his class at Harvard, very impressive young diplomat in the State Department. In 1940, he is on the presidential train riding back with FDR from the funeral of the House Speaker, William Bankhead, who happened to be the father of Tallulah Bankhead. And Wells was very drunk, and he starts propositioning a number of the porters on the train. And this story, finds its way to Washington, where people start gossiping about it. But no one would print anything about it. And that kind of shows you, again, this is before the war, right? This is why, again, I think World War II is so important. This is 1940. He's a rich and powerful diplomat. And it didn't really matter that he was gay. He was powerful enough that this was not something that people wrote about. If you were a rich and powerful man in Washington, your sexual peccadillos were not fair game for the media. And people got away with a lot of stuff that they shouldn't have gotten away with, right? And we know this now. And he could reasonably expect that he could get away with it. And this was brought to FDR's attention. FDR kind of made light of it. He said, well, Sumner wasn't doing it on government time, was he? So it's, what's the big deal? But then two things happen. One is World War II kicks off, and this sort of obsession with national security and blackmail begins. And then there's another gay scandal that happens in 1942, which is, again, after Pearl Harbor. And it involves an adversary of FDR's who happens to be a Democrat, but he's a conservative Democrat. He's a senator from Massachusetts named David Walsh, who is accused of frequenting a brothel in New York City near the Brooklyn Navy Yard, where Nazi spies are said to be congregating. The New York Post runs this story. They out David Walsh. It's the first outing in American politics. It happens in 1942, so it's the 80th anniversary this year. And it turns out that David Walsh was not at this brothel. He probably was gay, but this was a case of mistaken identity. But this sort of changes the rules now in Washington, because now you have people using this accusation of homosexuality in a public way that it's never been used before. And so it then takes another year. But by then, FDR's enemies on Capitol Hill, they are threatening to launch an investigation into Sumner Welles. And under pressure from his Secretary of State, who hated Sumner Welles, the two of them had a real rivalry for FDR's attention. FDR demands and accepts Welles's resignation in September 1943. And so Welles then becomes sort of the first known case of someone who's basically kicked out of the government for his homosexuality.
1948 brings an important turning point. That is when the Kinsey report comes out. It doesn't necessarily reveal homosexuality, but it does bring it to the forefront as suddenly there is something additional to worry about from a national security perspective. It is essentially theorized that if you were outed as gay, you can be trapped into either giving up America's secrets or keeping, giving them up, but also keeping secrets that, may, expose different parts of the national security state.
Yeah, the Kinsey report comes out very early in 1948, and it reports that 10% of American men are homosexual. And this number is probably grossly exaggerated, actually. I think it's closer probably to 2 to 3%. But regardless, this just sends a shockwave through the country. Suddenly this phenomena that was not talked about. You have to understand, homosexuality was not discussed. It was, in fact, during the David Walsh episode, the majority leader of the Senate referred to it as a crime too loathsome to mention in the presence of ladies and gentlemen in the Senate. That's how it was referred to. So to have this phenomenon sort of thrust into the national consciousness, and for it to be so pervasive, 10%, that's 1 out of every 10 people. This is shocking. And it's no longer just criminals or the mentally ill who are thought to be homosexuals. Now it could be the milkman. It could be your teacher. It could be senators, right? Respectable members of society. And sort of this sets off a nationwide sex panic. And then 2 years later, you have the rise of Joe McCarthy, who seizes on to these accusations about communists in the State Department. Just a couple of weeks after he makes that famous speech in West Virginia where he alleges that there are communists in the State Department, it is revealed that actually, in reality, 91 homosexuals had been fired from the State Department over the previous 3 years, or 91 people had been accused of homosexuality. In many cases, it was unclear. The evidentiary standard was not particularly high. So these two fears become conflated in the public mind, the fear of communism and the fear of homosexuality. Both of these groups can hide, right? You can't necessarily spot a homosexual. You can't spot the communists. They lurk in the shadows. They are subversive. They are rebellious against sort of bourgeois morality. So these two populations become conflated in the public imagination.
Baking from our childhoods just sticks in the memory, doesn't it? We never set off on holiday without piles of Tupperware. And there'd always be Bakewell slice, flapjacks, and tray baked scones in the boot.
Do you not do that, Lisa?
Yeah, no. Sadly, I do not stack the Tupperware in the back of the car when we go off on holiday.
Oh.
Welcome to Small Ways to Live Well, a new podcast from the Simple Things magazine. Season 2 is a pick-me-up tonic that helps us make the shift from winter to spring. A 6-week suggestion box full of things to note, notice and enjoy about the season. Search for Small Ways to Live Well on your podcast app.
How did the federal government start to then track it? It becomes grounds for dismissal for many different people who work for the government. And then this is also where we start to learn of the story of Franklin. I hope I'm saying it right. Kameny? Franklin Kameny.
Yeah.
So how did the federal government start to track people? And then how did Franklin Kameny become, one of the early, heroes?
Right. So the federal government under the Truman administration is really when the lavender scare truly begins. But it's happening informally. You have just the State Department and then other federal agencies just begin, um, rooting out gays, but it doesn't become codified until the Eisenhower administration, very early in the Eisenhower administration in April 1953, when President Eisenhower signs an executive order that prohibits sexual deviants or people guilty of sexual perversion is the term from holding government jobs and specifically from holding security clearances. And this leads to a real purge, full-scale purge of gay people from all sectors of the federal government, and not just in the security areas, right? Not just the State Department or the Defense Department, but even the Smithsonian Institution and the National Zoo. You could not hold a job if you were gay.
And the thinking was, if you are keeping this secret, you are ripe for blackmail.
Well, that's certainly in the security areas, right? But other jobs, it was just, no, you are a sexual pervert. This is a moral deficiency. It's also, let's not forget, homosexuality is a crime in every state in the country, right? It is a crime. Same-sex sexual relations is criminal. So these are the grounds for prohibiting gay people from federal government jobs. And then this sort of monumentally important moment happens when the man you mentioned, Frank Kameny, he is a Harvard-trained PhD astronomer, and in 1957, he's working for the Army Army Map Service, which is the predecessor to the Geospatial Intelligence Agency. They're basically, mapping the skies, right, for military intelligence. And this is just 2 months after Sputnik is launched. So this is the height of the space race. He's in a very important job. He's obviously very well trained. He is fired for being gay. And this just shows you how sort of obsessive the lavender scare was, that that the federal government would go out of its way to fire a Harvard-trained PhD astronomer at the height of the space race because he was gay. He decides that this is wrong, that he's supremely qualified, that his homosexuality has no bearing whatsoever on his ability to do his job, and he decides to sue. And in so doing, he becomes the first gay person to challenge the federal government over its anti-gay policy. Not even the ACLU will take his case, which I think is illustrative.
Yeah,
the ACLU would take the cases of communists or people accused of communism. They would not take the case of a homosexual, which is further evidence of what I claim in the book, which is that to be a homosexual was the most dangerous thing to be in Washington. It was worse than being a communist. A communist could have the ACLU to defend them. Also, a communist could become an anti-communist. You could renounce your comrades and your former beliefs. A homosexual could not do that. You were forever tarred, and there was no returning. And so Kameny, challenges this. He tries to get, the case is rejected. He tries to take it up to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court does not consider it. And he goes on to become really America's first gay activist, sustained gay activist. There had been some earlier attempts at gay rights activism. They'd all failed. But Kameny really becomes the first, and he starts the Mattachine Society of Washington, D.C., which is one of the first sustained gay rights organizations in the United States. He lobbies, Congress. He organizes the first picket outside the White House, and he's a really remarkable figure in our history.
Let's go to JFK. I named my daughter after him, so there are lots of good reasons for that, and some reasons I'm not so. There are some things I'm not as proud of, but there are certainly things I'm proud of, and one of the things is the way he approached this particular issue that I am glad that she bears his namesake. You write that he was comfortable around gay men, that he in some ways felt liberated by them. So I want you to explain that. I mean, it sounds like, they had private lives, and he certainly had private lives. He certainly had a private life, but there's the story of Lem Billings, who is a longtime friend, and we know how important JFK's friends and his circle were to him, even after he had his own presidential cabinet. He sort of had this sub cabinet that might have been even more important than his regular cabinet. So the story of Lem Billings is striking. He essentially hits on JFK as young men, and JFK's response, both on paper or on a napkin, and then after that, is quite telling to JFK's character. Explain it for us.
Yeah, so he and this young man Lem Billings, they were friends at Choate, which was the very Tony private school in Connecticut. And one of the sort of traditions that had been passed down from the British boarding schools that these New England prep schools were based on was, there was kind of rampant homosexuality in these institutions. And one of the ways in which the boys sort of communicated their feelings for each other was to write them down on scraps of toilet paper, because then they could be easily disposed of, were the teachers to find them or whatnot. And Lem Billings passed along some sort of amorous message to JFK, and JFK just sort of promptly wrote back saying, "I'm not that kind of boy." Now, I think in a lot of cases, and this was not just a kind of situational homosexuality with Lem. Lem was gay. A lot of the homosexuality that takes place in these all male institutions are not necessary. They're situational, right? They're not. It's not kind of deeply emotional or anything like that. But Lem was a gay man, and JFK accepted him, and they were best friends. They traveled together overseas. When JFK became president, Lem Billings had a room in the White House.
Yeah, that's striking. Yeah,
and this was known to the Kennedy family. Billings was quite discreet. It's not like he was bringing boyfriends over to the White House, but it was known, and he was accepted. And JFK was also friends with Gore Vidal, who was related to Jackie by they had a step grandfather in common, I believe. And there's an anecdote in the book that I recount where Vidal and Tennessee Williams are sort of walking behind JFK in Palm Beach and sort of joking about his, ogling his posterior. And Vidal mentions this to Kennedy, and Kennedy is sort of flattered by it and laughs, And this is not the way that most straight men in the 1960s, reacted around gay men. Like, this was just not, now it's sort of, it's much better, and most straight, a lot of straight men are comfortable in a way that they were not in the 1960s. It was still a very dangerous time to be gay. And again, it was still illegal in all 60 states in all 50 states until 1961, right? So JFK was just kind of, he's just kind of remarkably relaxed around gay men. And I do think it has something, I can't sort of psychoanalyze him, but I do think it has something to do with his own sort of unorthodox sex life.
Unorthodox is a way to put it.
One way to describe it, right?
Yes.
And
robust.
And maybe just a kind of sense like, there but for the grace of God go I. He had many sexual secrets of his own, and I think this maybe lent him a sense of kind of kinship, maybe perhaps with other gay men. This is just kind of based on the accounts of sort of the gay people around him, right? Vidal mostly, but William Walton, who was the arts advisor in the White House, who was also gay. Truman Capote, another writer who was, closer to Jackie, but certainly friendly with Jack as well. Joe Alsop, who was a very famous newspaper columnist who was closeted, but Jack Kennedy certainly knew that he was gay. So there was this kind of court of, gay men around John F. Kennedy that you really wouldn't see.
You could
really
just
any
see
other president.
You could just see JFK's flattering smile turning around to these guys walking behind him.
Yeah.
You can totally envision it. Richard Nixon, you write that in a sense, he and his, I guess we can't call them crimes, but his, alleged crimes were outed in the same way that gay men were, and that there was a lot of homosexual intrigue surrounding the Watergate break-in and the Nixon administration. Why?
Yeah, so one of the earliest episodes in the Nixon administration that I write about concerns the use of the kind of homosexual smear among Nixon consigliaries. And so there's a guy named Murray Chotiner who really kind of taught Richard Nixon how to use dirty tricks, going way back to his first election for Congress in California. And Chotiner didn't get a job in the White House when Nixon became president, and he was kind of embittered about this. And he blamed it on John Ehrlichman and Bob Haldeman, the two closest Nixon aides. And he sort of spreads the rumor. He plants the rumor with a reporter that Ehrlichman, Haldeman, and a younger aide named Dwight Chapin were involved in a homosexual menage a trois, and they would meet at the Watergate every morning in Haldeman's apartment before going on to the White House. And this is completely made up, but he plants it with a reporter. The reporter then takes it to the FBI to see if they can get any kind of, if they had any information about this. And then this launches a kind of witch hunt within the Nixon White House, where these men are interrogated by J. Edgar Hoover and Mark Felt, the deputy director of the FBI, who would much later be revealed as Deep Throat. They're interrogating these men about their sex lives. And it turns out it's completely false, but Nixon might have believed it. That's why he pressed this investigation. And then he's so angry that he tries to retaliate against the journalist who Chotiner started this rumor with. He then believes that this journalist might be gay. And when this journalist prints confidential information about the Nixon administration, their policy on a war in India, in Bangladesh, Nixon comes up with this cockamamie theory that there is a leaker in the National Security Council who might be having a gay relationship with this reporter who reported this confidential information, and that launches another sort of homosexual witch hunt. So Nixon basically sees homosexuality lurking behind all these events. And it goes back to his involvement in the Hiss Chambers case, which I document at length in 1948. It's the first big spy drama of the Cold War. And there are rumors and insinuations that Alger Hiss, who's a State Department diplomat, who's accused of being a communist spy by Whittaker Chambers, newspaper columnist for Time magazine. There are rumors that those two men are gay, and that Chambers is a spurned homosexual. Nixon sort of believes this. And he's, 25 years later, he's talking about the Hiss Chambers case and the fact that the two of them might have been homosexual. He's talking about this case with his aides to kind of explain why he thinks that the responsibility for this leak, is due to the homosexual relationship between the leaker and the journalist. And then he thinks that Daniel Ellsberg, the Pentagon Papers leaker, he thinks that he might be a homosexual. And this is what really starts Watergate, is the break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office in California, in Beverly Hills. And this is where the White House plumbers get their start, is to find dirt on Daniel Ellsberg, who is the man who's working for the Rand Corporation. He's leaking the Pentagon Papers, and Nixon suspects that maybe he's a homosexual, right? So he sees homosexuality lurking everywhere. And I was talking earlier about how this issue of homosexuality provides a window into kind of the souls of our presidents. And, Nixon was a really paranoid guy.
I was just going to ask you, this feels like there's a Seinfeld joke where like all men are afraid that they could be gay at some level. And that's what this sort of sounds like.
Well, I don't know if Nixon himself was concerned about being perceived that way. He was certainly kind of teased about it. I do write about that. Him being sort of awkward. He had this friendship with a guy named Bibi Rebozo, and there were people who speculated that there might be something more to it. But there is this there is this kind of terror, this obsession, this paranoia about homosexuality. And, I document at length the transcripts of the White House tapes that Nixon recorded of his own conversations with his aides. And it just comes up repeatedly in various ways. Like he'll go on these rants.
Were you expecting that as you did the research?
I had been aware of it before. These excerpts had been reported on, but not so thoroughly.
Tell us about the rants. Tell us about the rants.
Like,
I want to hear. I cut you off.
He's watching an episode of All in the Family, the television show. By mistake, he wanted to watch, I think, the baseball game, but like CBS put this show on instead, and he decides to watch it, and he's disappointed because there's this character, Archie Bunker, who's a real kind of Nixon Democrat, right? Like he's a hard hat, he describes him, and he doesn't like the fact that Archie is the butt of all the jokes. And there's this other character who's an obvious homosexual, a fag, as Nixon describes him, and he's presented as being this kind of cool character, and he's fashionable. And Nixon doesn't like the fact that, Hollywood and television is promoting this, that they're making fun of the hard hat character, the white working class guy who's a Nixon guy and from Queens, and they're romanticizing the gay character. And there's a whole and this leads to a whole conversation with Ehrlichman and Haldeman about how homosexuality leads to the downfall of societies, and it goes, and then Kissinger chimes in. The Greeks were all homosexuals, and that's why ancient Greece collapsed, and then Rome collapsed for similar reasons. And the Soviets are trying to promote homosexuality because they know it's the enemy of strong societies. They promote drugs and homosexuality. And there's another conversation where Nixon's going on about how the fashion designers hate women. And that's why the fashion designs are so terrible, because they hate, this is really bizarre. The fashion designers hate women. I don't know where that came from.
Who they think's buying the clothes, right?
Yeah, exactly, right? All the great fashion designers are gay. But they hate women, and they take out their hatred on women by designing these awful clothes. And he's just like, there's so many examples of this where he's frequently returning to homosexuality.
I got to get to two. I got to get to two more presidents before we wrap things up. And I need to maybe what I thought was the most fascinating story of all the ones that you told, which is the story of Billy Sipple. And I certainly knew what happened in the moment of this assassination attempt on Gerald Ford, but to see it taken to the length that it was taken to go deeply reported here, and to find out what happened to Billy Sipple after his secret was exposed truly was shocking. And I was sitting there with my mouth agape reading this story in your book. I don't know how I missed it. I've got 400 books here, and I don't know why it was never followed to the length that you followed it to once the assassination attempt was over. But James, just tell us about the story of Billy Sipple and the guy who may have saved the president's life and ultimately lost his own life because of his secret that got out.
Yeah, well, he did save the president's life. He was a Vietnam veteran, and he just happened to be, standing in the right place at the right time outside the hotel in San Francisco in September 1975, where Gerald Ford was walking out, and a woman, a crazed follower of the Manson cult, raised a pistol, fired a shot, trying to kill Ford. And Sipple, put his hand out right at the right moment, hit her hand. The bullet hit a wall, missed Gerald Ford. He saves the president's life. And it turns out, and then what happens is tragic, and it's kind of unintentional tragedy. But Harvey Milk, who was not yet a city councilor in San Francisco, but kind of a budding political figure, he wanted the world to know that the man who saved the life of the president was gay, because he thought that this would, help the gay cause. And he leaks it to a newspaper columnist, Herb Cain, who's kind of a legendary columnist for the San Francisco Chronicle, who writes it in his column. It then is picked up by the wires, by all the newspapers, and it becomes a big story that the man who saved Gerald Ford's life is a homosexual. And it ruined Sipple's life. Like many people, Sipple came to, like many gay people in the 70s, Sipple moved to San Francisco to kind of escape wherever it was that they were coming from, the kind of homophobia of their local community. And instantly, Sipple's family disowned him. His mother gave an interview where she said, we were so proud of Oliver, which was his birth name. But then we found out he was queer, and now I can't leave the house. I'm so ashamed. And when she died, his father and brothers would not let him come to the funeral. And it really became a burden on him. And he ended up, drinking himself to death. And so it's an important story to know, just because I think the theme of outing, I talked about that at the beginning, and it's one that is really hovers over this book. When is it appropriate to disclose a person's sexual orientation? And I think this is an example of when it's not. Yeah. Because it wasn't really relevant to the story. And then there are consequences that you can't appreciate or you can't know, that you don't know what a person's going through. You don't know what their personal life is like.
Yeah, their family.
And so I think that, that was an important lesson that I think I learned in this book.
All right, we made it to the Reagan, the Reagan administration, and this is some of your original reporting. I thought it was fascinating, and I want to read the first sentence of, I guess this was adapted from the book, but it's in the book. It was 3:15 the morning of June 26, 1980, and Congressman Bob Livingston was extraordinarily drunk, hiding in the congressional gym beneath the Rayburn House office building, petrified that a team of highly trained right-wing homosexual assassins working on behalf of Ronald Reagan was about to kill him. What?
Yeah, this was something I found in Ben Bradley's papers. It was a story that the Washington Post investigated just a couple weeks before Ronald Reagan was nominated by the Republican Party to be president. And it was a story involving this accusation that Ronald Reagan was being controlled like a Manchurian candidate by a cabal of right-wing homosexual advisors. And part of this story involved Bob Livingston, who was a Republican congressman from Louisiana, who was most famous for during the Clinton impeachment. He was going to be speaker after Newt Gingrich resigned. But then, Larry Flint, the publisher of Hustler magazine, he was on a campaign to expose any Republican who was supporting impeachment of Clinton who had their own affairs. And Bob Livingston had a number of extramarital affairs, and he very famously and dramatically, resigned the job of House Speaker before he actually accepted it. So that's what Bob Livingston was most famous for, was his kind of central role in the Clinton sex scandal. But there was this other sex scandal that he was involved in that's never been reported on before, where he happened to be going out for dinner with a lobbyist in Washington who was working for kind of, right-wing interests in Central America. So various kind of right-wing governments and, the Contras and kind of military juntas and whatnot. And they went out for dinner and they had drinks and they got really drunk. And this guy basically made a pass at Bob Livingston. And, Livingston was pretty drunk himself at this point. And over the course of their dinner, they were discussing these rumors that, Reagan had these gay men working for him. These rumors went back to the 1960s when Reagan was governor of California. And he fired a number of his aides because they were accused of being gay. And there were Jack Kemp, who would go on to become a congressman, the professional football player. He was implicated in that scandal. Kemp was being talked about as a vice presidential nominee at this time. And so Livingston kind of got into his head that there are these gay men around Reagan. There's some kind of connection to these right-wing forces in Central America. I don't really know what's going on. He drove to the Capitol in a fright and spent the night sleeping in the house gym because he was terrified that there was this group of shady right-wing pro-Reagan gay men who were, going to use violence to get their way. And this was one aspect of this very kind of crazy story that I document in the book that was brought to Ben Bradley at the Washington Post. He assigned his top investigative reporters, including Bob Woodward, to investigate these accusations. They fanned out across the country. They interviewed numerous people. They tried to track down, more information. I'll leave it to readers to find out what happens. Needless to say, Ronald Reagan was nominated and, did become president of the United States. But this conspiracy theory was, suitably concerning or serious enough that Bradley would, take it seriously and assign his best reporters to scope it out.
I wanted to ask about Don't Tell, but we're getting pressed for time here. So maybe we can melt it into this question. In Washington, D.C., were gay rights ahead of or behind what was happening in the rest of the country? You say it was a center of gay change, despite it being the center of attention there.
Well, in some sense, yes. I mean, in 1975, that's the year that the Civil Service Commission rescinded the ban on gay people working in the federal government. And that was due to a lot of lobbying from people like Frank Kameny. And that came before a lot of cities and states, passed anti-discrimination statutes. So Washington, D.C., at least the federal government, in a way, becomes one of the earliest, trailblazers in allowing gay people to work openly, which is kind of strange, given the history I've discussed, where it was one of the most oppressive places. But then Washington becomes this kind of oddly, open place, at least the places that didn't require a security clearance. In 1995, 20 years later, that's when Bill Clinton rescinded the ban on gay people receiving security clearances. But Washington, D.C. does become this, very gay-friendly city in a way. And today it might be actually the highest per capita in terms of its LGBT population. It's about 10%. So, as I say in the book, Washington is simultaneously, throughout this period, it's simultaneously the gayest, but also the anti-gayest city in America, which, as a city that thrives on hypocrisy, I think is a kind of, it's a very appropriate characteristic.
How many patriots were too afraid to serve their country?
Well, there's no way to know, right? I mean, we have no way of knowing how many gay people didn't even apply for jobs, right? Because they knew that they would never get one, right? Or they knew that if they might get a job, they'd have to live a lie and they'd have to live under this constant threat of being exposed. So I think the cost is incalculable. But fortunately, now that's a thing of the past. And now we have, an openly gay cabinet secretary who was the first openly gay man to run for president on a major party presidential ticket and to run a real serious campaign. I mean, Pete Buttigieg really made history.
Yeah, he was in the last couple, 2-3 candidates left before Biden.
Yeah, and he was a real leading candidate, and his sexual orientation, I don't think at all hurt him. If anything, I think it probably helped him, actually.
One of the points you make in the book that I thought was interesting is the liberation of gay America liberated everyone. Explain why you characterized it that way.
This was something that our country feared tremendously. And it was completely irrational. It was completely irrational. And it drove people to do terrible things. It drove people to betray their friends, their family, their neighbors, their colleagues. Like I said, this was a fear that was people were more afraid of this than they were afraid of communism. And it was totally unjustified. And it ruined so many lives. And I think our country is just a better place for it, that we now don't treat gay people this way. And I think straight people have benefited enormously from these changes, that we now, respect people's privacy more in a way that we might not have before. We respect the right of individuals to live their lives as they see fit. I think these are beneficial changes that benefit everyone in our country, not just gay people.
You said towards the end of the book, and I really was emotional about this, a gay Vietnam veteran got a medal for killing 2 men, but discharged for loving one. Very poignant.
Yeah.
To put that at the end, and you felt that was obviously important to point out.
Yeah, that's on the headstone of a man named Leonard Matlovich, who was the first gay soldier to challenge the military's gay ban openly. He does that in 1975. In fact, he's actually on the cover of Time magazine just a week before Oliver Sipple saved Gerald Ford's life, right? So you have these 2 veterans these two gay veterans really doing something heroic. Leonard Matlovich would end up dying of AIDS, and he would be buried in Congressional Cemetery here in Washington, D.C., and he chose his burial plot to be as close as he could get it to J. Edgar Hoover, who's a man that we didn't mention in this podcast, but who obviously,
I forgot about that.
who obviously looms very large over this book as the director of the FBI for almost 50 years, and may have been gay himself. Obviously, he's subject to these rumors, but he is really leading the federal government purge against gay people. And Matlovich got himself buried there, and he wanted to do that because he saw that there was no, gay people didn't have a kind of monument. They didn't have any kind of physical place where they could honor their, we started this podcast, right, talking about the kind of generational challenge that gay people have, and that it's not something that is passed through, it's not hereditary, right? So there's no kind of monument that gay people have where they can, honor their ancestors. And so he wanted to kind of do something like that. So he is buried in Congressional Cemetery. And what happened is that a lot of other gay people started buying up plots around his, such that today there is what's called a kind of gay corner at Congressional Cemetery, where you have a whole smattering of gay people buried there. And there's no other cemetery like this in the world, right? Like, there are Jewish cemeteries, obviously. There are African-American cemeteries. There are lots of cemeteries that are, maybe devoted to certain kind of ethnic groups and whatnot. Gay people didn't have this really until now, where there's this kind of impromptu gay resting place.
No pressure whatsoever, but I'm sure your fingers are sore and your eyes have been blown out from writing the 650-page book, which is a great book, by the way, and I really enjoyed reading it. Have you decided at all what's next, or you're going to take it slow, given you've just completed a completely massive undertaking?
Yeah, I have a number of projects in the fire, none that I can really speak of at the time, but I am doing, journalism, which is where I come from. So I'm a columnist for Tablet Magazine, and I write for, various places, and readers can follow me on Twitter or go to my website to kind of see the work that I'm producing on a more regular basis.
Is it kind of tough to do a sequel on this, given the, as you put it, times have changed?
Yeah, I don't see myself doing a sequel to this book. I think I ended it pretty deliberately. And if people, I'm not, by no means am I saying that there's not more to explore on this subject. I think there certainly is. But I'll leave that to future historians.
James Kirchick, the author of Secret City, The Hidden History of Gay Washington. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Check out the book. Check out his website, jameskirchick.com. He's also on Twitter @JKirchick. I want to invite listeners to our Patreon page to ask for your support in keeping the show going. Go to patreon.com/AxelBankHistory. We will donate part of your contributions to a charity for children's literacy. And thank you for listening to Axel Bank Reports History and Today, conversations with America's top nonfiction authors and why their books matter right now. Check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram @AxelBankHistory. We update those with clips from the show, guest announcements, and book recommendations. See you next time. Thanks.